Okay, so this is kind of a yes and, because yes, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is an Appalachian murder ballad, and so is the rest of the series. I just didn't really clock it until the last time I was listening to the songs from the movie version of Ballad and thinking about how they fit into the greater history of music as a form of protest in the American South. However, Suzanne Collins is not herself from the American South. Girl grew up in Connecticut, girl absolutely was a military brat, moved all around, lived in Belgium for a little while, and now lives back in Connecticut. But she has done extensive research, and it really super shows. And it's not accidental that she consistently gave Katniss an Appalachian accent when she was reading aloud from the first trilogy. It's not an accident that when we hear her reading this first chapter from Sunrise on the Reaping, she gives Haymitch an accent as well. Like, we're not going to fight about where District 12 is. It's pretty solidly somewhere in that little triangle of West Virginia, North Carolina. So what's a murder ballad? Originally, a murder ballad is a thing that sort of sprung out of the ballad tradition of narrative song, usually depicting an event. In the case of a murder ballad, is the event. And while many ballads remembered and performed in the US are kind of from the British Isles more than anything else, there are various ballad traditions from all over Europe. In the US, most murder ballads come out of Appalachia, where the majority of the early settlers were from the Anglo-Scottish border country. In fact, most people don't realize how similar the American South, and specifically places like the Piedmont, the foothills, and Appalachia are when it comes to accents, to some isolated parts of the UK, down to dialect. I used to play this game in college where I would speed up a recording of somebody from the deep south, and I would slow down a recording of somebody from rural Scotland, and they end up sounding a lot alike. But we're talking about music. So let's be clear. In the context of folk music, ballad has a different meaning from modern day musical parlance. Historically, a ballad is a song or a poem that chronicles a particular story with or without music. Broadside ballads were poems about real life events that were printed and distributed to the public. Eventually, sometimes melodies got added, and we start to see these ballads being performed by musicians, which accounts for a lot of variations on the different songs. And it's really important to know that broadside ballads acted as a way to convey information throughout communities, kind of like tabloids, but also usually talking about some variation on a real event, often as a warning. There is a whole conversation to be had about misogyny and femicide in murder ballads. The women that these songs are mostly about were usually perceived as innocent, helpless victims who were led astray by their lovers, who more often than not were the murderers in the murder ballad. And they're like super powerless against their fate. The messages of these songs were meant as warnings to other young women to not go down that same path. And the men are like kind of portrayed in a weirdly sympathetic way. They don't come across as super responsible for their own actions. They're like co-victims in crimes of passion. If you're familiar with these songs, Omi Wise, Pearl Bryan, those are both really good examples. It's somewhere around the 1940s when women begin regularly reclaiming murder ballads as their own, writing and recording original music and putting women in positions of power. And what many listeners don't realize is that traditional American murder ballads often depicted the real and true murders of women. Many were pregnant, often killed by the father of their unborn child. Maybe their lovers were already married and with a different social standing, whatever. These women became a problem that needed to be taken care of. Again, this is a warning. We are talking about femicide and misogyny as much as anything else. But we can also expand this context to include modern American folk songs that have flipped that context on its head. So I'm talking about songs like Goodbye Earl by the Chicks or Ayuka by the Secret Sisters. You can even throw No Body, No Crime by Taylor Swift in this category. Now, given that context, please, I beg of you, give The Ballad of Lucy Gray or The Hanging Tree another listen. Those are murder ballads, and they are specifically Appalachian murder ballads. And yes, American murder ballad is a broader range of music, but I'm talking specifically about Appalachia because we are talking about the Hunger Games. And District 12 is a coal mining town in what can very easily be inferred to be North Carolina or West Virginia. And that is a place where music, particularly folk music, specifically a genre that has been reclaimed and rewritten, as much as murder ballads have a very specifically regional history. And more than that, it's a history that is directly tied to protests and union rights in a way that is directly relevant to the Hunger Games. So now, let's talk about the narrative structure of the Hunger Games as a series. I could be a real book nerd about it and talk about how each book is specifically split up into 3 acts, each of which tells a complete story, how one of those acts is usually about hope, one is about failure, and then the third one's usually a bittersweet story where there might be some wins and some losses, but the only thing to do is move forward, and how that 3-act structure is then reflected in books 1, 2, and 3 as the same narrative pattern. It's why I strongly suspect that we will get a 3rd prequel that directly foreshadows Mockingjay. I could talk about narrative symbolism until I'm blue in the face. But instead, I want to talk about the fact that each one of these books revolves around women making choices, inadvertently or not, that doom them within the narrative. And likewise, each of these stories also features women taking charge of a narrative that has doomed them and flipping it on its head. When we think about the structure of a classic Appalachian ballad, it usually goes like this, keeping in mind that verse form is almost always strophic, meaning that it is multiple verses sung along to the same tune, and that is usually but not necessarily consistently in a structure of A-A-B-B. Two parts, each repeated once, looping around as long as needed. And I'm gonna go ahead and infer with that what we're really dealing with is The Hunger Games is verse 1 in a way that Ballad is verse 2, and they both loop to the same tune. Then we see that again with Catching Fire and with Sunrise on the Reaping. Anyway, in these songs, we usually have girl is introduced and or girl's love interest is introduced. Girl falls for a guy. Girl is then placed in life-threatening situation and or guy turns out to be the life-threatening situation. Guy gets away with whatever he's doing. Eventually, some form of justice or a warning for the general population so that they don't end up like the girl happens. And we see this play out really clearly in The Hunger Games and in Ballad, but the other structure that we see a fair amount in classic Appalachian ballads is as follows. Here's a story that you think you know. Everybody knows this story. Actually, you're wrong about everything. Actually, you're wrong about everything, and the person telling the story is unreliable. Updates, and this is usually the final verse, the person telling the story is now confessing, but it's a soliloquy, and they're gonna get away with everything that they've done for like a very long time. And that brings me to the other underlying theme of murder ballads, which is that the existing justice system is inherently unfair or rigged, and the institutions around the characters in the songs are not to be trusted. And to some extent, we see that in Ballad because it's from Snow's point of view, and it's literally framed as the Ballad of Lucy Gray. But it's way more accurate to say that we see this structure and these themes very clearly in Catching Fire when Katniss starts properly playing the game, and it's very accurate to Mockingjay. More than anything, the upended truth of a story that everyone thinks they know holds true really directly for Haymitch and Sunrise. It's a structural and thematic comparison that makes a lot of sense to me, and murder ballads are almost always about people circumventing the justice system, and the rest of Appalachian folk music is very much about protests and standing together against an unjust authority and pushing back against company towns and capitalistic control. And in terms of content, they are always a lesson. They are meant to be sung along and danced to, sure, but more than that, Appalachian ballads contain a lesson that is meant to be passed down orally, which ties in pretty directly with the idea that Suzanne only writes when she has something to say, or Lucy Gray only sings when she has something to say. So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that it is not at all accidental, and I just think it's really cool. Like, I'm a big old word nerd, I'm from the South, I like music, and I think that this is something that we should all be paying a little bit more attention to.